Rishi is an old, deep word. In India, where sages and holy men are accepted as part of the everyday scene, Rishi is still reserved as a term of ultimate respect. A Rishi knows reality in its deeper sense, and the great Rishis who flourished thousands of years ago are considered the fathers of mankind. Their spirits flowed like fountains, and the waters continue to give Indian culture its very life. When I chose the title of my book, which became the basis for this program, I didn't mean to say that Vasishtha, Bhardwaj, and the other ancient sages are back. The Rishi who has returned is inside you and me, for the Rishi is the soul. It also means the knower inside every human mind. When this knower, the soul, is asleep, people forget themselves. They lose the memory of man's central place in the scheme of nature and therefore fall prey to disasters such as war, sickness, turmoil, and other forms of unhappiness. The goal of life is to wake up from this false condition and regain the power of a Rishi, of the soul, this territory where the slightest desire is taken as a command by the forces that shape reality. Ayurveda is the traditional system of Indian medicine that has descended to us directly from the ancient Rishis. A decade ago, Ayurveda, which means the science of life in Sanskrit, was virtually unknown in the West. Now it has surged into prominence, first capturing the attention of people who already accept the tenets of holistic health, then spreading to the public at large. Why has this happened? Some reasons are self-evident. Our present system of medicine rides in a nearly hopeless crisis, and people are looking desperately for a more humane alternative. Ayurveda contains the spiritual element that Western scientific medicine jettisoned 300 years ago. Patients thirst for this missing element. They have experienced for themselves that a healthy body is meaningless if the mind remains in pain. Unfortunately, most current medical education prepares doctors to treat only physical distress. They may be moved, even deeply moved, by their patients' feelings, but these are a side issue nevertheless. The main issue is whether a real disease is present. When the real disease is gone, the patient is considered cured. Yet this attitude ignores the fact that a patient's sense of discomfort usually precedes the onset of illness and contributes to it. For me, the goal of Ayurveda is to transform the patient's personal reality. That means taking his subjective viewpoint as seriously as I take his physical condition. When I left my private practice in endocrinology in 1985 to pursue Ayurveda full-time, one of my former partners said sorrowfully, "What's happened to you, Deepak? You used to be a good doctor." His words made me feel both sad and irritated. Does a good doctor wear blinders, seeing his patients as walking syndromes and not as people to be loved and cared for? This program is the story of how I found answers to those questions.
Doctor, we need you on surgical 4. We've had an expiration.
Shortly after I arrived for my first night on call in an American hospital, I heard that nurse's voice calling me. "A what?" I asked. She carefully repeated.
An expiration on surgical 4. We need you to pronounce.
"Oh, right," I said. Could I tell her I wasn't catching on? It was midsummer of 1970, and I was the newest intern in a 400-bed community hospital in New Jersey. Everyone here apparently knew what an expiration was. I didn't. The nurse had the voice of a veteran, I could tell. She continued, "We've just extubated him, so if you can come up." I didn't want to seem stupid. I was entitled to be called doctor even as a first-day intern, but all the rungs of the system rose above me. Just a year before, I had graduated from medical school in India. 6 months of that year were spent in a village posting, where the lights went out every time it rained. I had not actually set foot in an American hospital until I became a doctor in one. I was very eager to train in advanced American medicine. The hospital had wired me a plane ticket from New Delhi and a cab fare to the hotel. I was supposed to rest a while and then report for duty. So far, all I knew about America came from watching 2 hours of color TV in my hotel room the night before. My wife Rita and I had never seen a color TV before. On the screen, 2 bodies were being wheeled into an emergency room after a police chase. We could see bullet wounds and blood. I was amazed. Rita, I said suddenly, those men they shot, they're taking them to the hospital I will be at tomorrow night. What if I had arrived a day earlier? I went to sleep thinking about it. Now it was the next night, and I was more than a little nervous about being on call alone. I was supposed to handle all the emergencies for the hospital and admit patients I deemed serious enough to need a bed. I was told not to wake up my chief resident unless the situation became impossible to handle alone. I was determined not to let that happen. They could shoot whomever they wanted to. I waited. After 2 hours, the time began to drag, so I went to the cafeteria and bolted a sandwich. When I came back, the nurses said I hadn't missed anything. I waited some more. At about 8, the first call came. Surgical 4 was having its expiration. There's no limit to what they have in America, I thought. When I stepped onto the ward floor, the first thing I saw was a small crowd, about 8 people, gathered outside one of the rooms. A nurse softly padded over and whispered, "The expiration is in room 441, doctor. I'll come with you." She parted away and led me into the darkened room. A certain unmistakable tone came from the visitors as I walked through, but I didn't know exactly what I would see. The nurse had sounded routine, a little subdued. What attitude was I supposed to wear? Without warning, my heart started pounding. Real medicine, real doctor. On a bed, stripped of covers, I saw a man surrounded by dangling IV tubes, oxygen tanks, a heart monitor, a respirator, and more metering gadgetry that I was as yet unfamiliar with. He must have been about 55. His frame was wasted and his skin looked yellowish. His bulging eyes stared at the ceiling without a blink. He was so still. His caved-in chest showed no sign of rising and falling. I glanced at the monitor. Nothing. My pulse went racing suddenly into my temples, and the floor sagged a few inches. "Is he dead?" I blurted out. The nurse searched me with a glance. A few seconds went by. "I told you we had an expiration. Why don't you pronounce him?" she asked. "I have to get back to my station. Breaks in 20 minutes. A mortal body that has been discarded a minute before is not at all like a cadaver. If I wanted to press my palm against this human husk, it would feel just slightly cool, but it would get colder and colder as long as I held on. I had no notion of doing such a thing. Strangeness can be very close to dread. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked timidly. "Say he's dead," the nurse told me. She waited a second. "Only a doctor can do that over here." She added a note of emphasis when she said "over here." But she didn't mean it personally. During the Vietnam doctor shortage, the hospital had scraped up 5 Germans and 2 Indians to be the staff physicians. At least the Indians spoke English. I looked at the screens. Everything was flat. I was like the last machine, the one that said that the others were right. "Sure, he's dead." Sensing my confusion, the nurse whispered to me, "Then you're supposed to tell the family. That's all of them out there." We walked out to face the 8 strangers huddled together in the corridor. They looked at me with that prepared look. The nurse nudged me from behind. I took my stethoscope out of my jacket and hung it around my neck. Oh God, I had forgotten to ask what the dead man's name was. One of the men came forward. Doctor? I was trembling faintly inside, but I cut him short. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, sir, I said, but we have had an expiration. Two of the women burst into tears and took comfort in each other's arms. Another of the men popped up and said in a businesslike way, I'll get the funeral home. He trotted off toward the phones. I was staring at the floor, not wanting to say a word more, but feeling that I should. The nurse tugged at my arm. She had a decent heart. Come on, doctor. We keep the coffee behind the station. Want some? The cigarette machine is over there. I looked gratefully at her. She seemed wonderfully neutral just at that moment. Without any comment or bother, her expression simply said, you look like you could use something. My first American patient had been a dead man. It wasn't as I had expected, and not just a corpse. Everything had been medically proper, yet so unhealthy. The machines were in the room, and the family was outside the door. That seemed peculiar to me. In India, the family is in the room, and the machines are nowhere. I followed the nurse. After a few hours, my shift became more and more hectic, but the rest of the night seemed not so bad. I worked hard for the next 10 hours. I didn't drink 1 cup of coffee to keep me going, but 5, and I smoked not 1 cigarette, but a pack. I treated a middle-aged man for an overdose of barbiturates, a young woman with severe bleeding after she attempted to perform an abortion on herself, a vagrant drunk with several long lacerations to the scalp, and a retired lawyer in the throes of a massive heart attack. When the night was over and my shift on call came to its end, I almost felt like a hero. I had saved all these people. My chief resident congratulated me. He was happy that no one had waked him up all night for once. He took me to breakfast in the cafeteria, and I dragged on the last couple of cigarettes and cups of coffee while I made my full report. He was encouraging. Keep it up and you'll get out of here with a good recommendation. You want to make it to Boston or someplace like that? I nodded. Really, you've got a chance. The big league is not so far away. I took his word for it. He was serious and imposing, a fact resident in his 3rd year. Now that he was chief resident, he was used to being right. He said goodbye and told me to get some rest. I was on call again in 12 hours. I went over to the dormitory where interns rested between shifts. I placed my clothes over the back of a chair and lay down on a cot, but I was too exhausted to sleep. Part of me went racing ahead, wanting nothing more than to get back into the emergency room and handle more patients. Another part kept touching a sore spot. The whole episode with my first patient couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, 7 at most, but I was nagged by a sense of failure. The restless emotions I felt then, I can easily feel to this day. I blamed myself for not bringing solace to a dying man, yet we had no relation to each other at all. I had not even drawn a sheet over him or held him for a moment in my thoughts. All at once, but for good, I saw the great abnormality of the world I had stepped into. I came to medicine when I was 16. On the day I graduated from high school, I surprised my father by saying, "Daddy, I want to be a doctor." Those are blessed words in India when you are the eldest son and your father is a physician. He was overjoyed that after years of indifference toward medicine, I wanted to be like him. Since boyhood, I had been madly in love with soccer and cricket, and whenever I thought for a moment about my future, I saw myself probably as a journalist. Now I decided that medicine was the right pursuit for me, and my motivation grew the more I dwelt on it. I wanted to heal people and make them happy. I was sure of it. I had been suddenly converted to medicine by reading Sinclair Lewis's novel Aerosmith. I watched my father see patients every day of my life, of course, but they had not registered on me. It took a book. I can't remember much about Arrowsmith himself, except that he was a heroic researcher, a microbe hunter, driven by an incredible dedication. In the book, he says, God, give me unclouded eyes and freedom from haste. God, give me quiet and relentless anger against all pretense and all pretentious work and all work left slack and unfinished. God, give me a restlessness whereby I may neither sleep nor accept praise till my observed results equal my calculated results, or in pious glee I discover and assault my error. God, give me strength not to trust God. These words once thrilled me. I can hardly read them now, but I am glad that at that age I swallowed the whole story. It had what I needed. The hero was a doctor, and the doctor was a hero. At moments he was almost a god, bringing healing to skeptical mortals. Arrowsmith spoke words that were more than words. They were sparks, hammered hot from the anvil of his dedication. I embraced his dedication and his life, and I would go forth like him. While I was going through all this, I don't believe I mentioned the book to my father. He must have considered, however, that I might be motivated by fantasy. He told me soberly about the burden of work I was taking on to become a doctor. Until then, I had shown no interest in medicine, so my background in science was sketchy. He quickly filled my nights at home with tutors in math and chemistry, hired for his lagging but determined boy. The boy was ready to study now and burning to get ahead. My father, so immensely pleased, only repeated his cautions and tried to make me see that doctoring was not as idealistic as I had thought. I lay there in my dorm room that second night in America, thinking about it. In the end, after 6 years of studying, medicine was turning out to have too little to do with healing and making people happy. It had to do instead with my work in the hospital, treating strangers for injuries and maladies that had dropped into their lives, and pronouncing a few of them, the most unlucky ones, as expirations. I thought about myself a lot before I forced myself to sleep, but on reflection, I didn't think about my patients much. The girl in desperate agony from her abortion was probably no better off now, even if she wasn't bleeding anymore. The drunk reeled around the ER, out of his senses, oblivious to the streaming gash across his forehead. The grey-faced lawyer clutched at his chest, certain that at that very moment he was dying. The ashamed man with the barbiturate overdose, he was probably a respectable addict who had taken one too many that night, or maybe two, maybe a lot more than two. I didn't know any of their names. I was thinking of them, if I thought about them at all, as the abortion, the overdose, the laceration, and the heart attack. They were my America. In a way, it was beginning to seem normal. The veterans had grown used to it. I wasn't going to let it get to me either. I could already see 1971 as the year I bagged a residency at a teaching hospital in Boston. I lay there dreaming of Harvard as much as anything else. The boy in me still burned to get ahead. I had been told that the ticket out was a good recommendation from the chief of medicine at this hospital. I could do what it took. I was making a good impression from day one. It was easy for me to mix with the nurses at their station, who sloughed off their boredom with jokes and coffee in between ambulances. When an ambulance did drive up, the scene changed in an instant, almost to hysteria. We moved. I lived for that action, and I knew I would be good at it. But for that first night, I was more a stranger than anything else. Who were these people? How was my life connected with theirs? My first patient was slipping into a shallow grave, and I was marching on. After a few minutes of these night thoughts, I slept like a stone. Medicine began as more than either science or art. Hippocrates, who walks with every physician, really was an angelic doctor. He claimed descent directly from Aesculapius, the Greek god of healing. In his own life he was revered. He did not just sew up wounds, he added a stitch toward his patient's immortality. We do not know much about the methods of Hippocrates, but we have some of his words. His medicine was wisdom. In fragments of his teaching we can read such statements as this: even though a patient may be aware that his condition is perilous, he may yet recover because he has faith in the goodness of his physician. In taking the Hippocratic Oath itself, every doctor swears to this: I will keep pure and holy both my life and my art. Since we know very little about the practice of the art Hippocrates was master of, his noble words do not have much connection to reality anymore. The medicine I was taught had been stripped of ideals altogether in favor of a practical zeal for repairing the bodies of sick people. The best doctors I have met in every field are scientists of great integrity and skill. Their goal in life is to track down the cause of disease with precise objectivity, and then they hope to wipe it out. I can state without even pausing to think about it that no colleague of mine has ever alluded to his pure and holy art. For their part, the ancients appear to have little in the way of a scientific foundation for their medicine, but they grasped the nature of man. Their first principle was that health requires a balance within the body. As a piece of received truth, this is easy enough to roll off the tongue, but its implications have been carried far from the ancient world. Today we speak of the body's homeostatic mechanisms, and we pursue biochemical research to discover such things as how the autonomic nervous system mediates the secretions of the endocrine glands. But we are still talking about balance within the body, and we still find it absolutely vital to preserve it. The ancients also believed that man's inner nature mirrors nature as we observe it around us. Cosmos, or the universe, comprised two fundamental and related realms, the inner and outer. Balancing their forces made it possible for life to continue in harmony. The two ran on parallel tracks, so to speak, and throwing either one into imbalance spelled disaster for both. The ancient physicians thought they understood the universal basis of life, and they desired to live from its source. Their precepts for health may sound simple-minded to us now, because they are not based on reliable information about the body. The Greeks had either bad data about physiology or no data at all. It is therefore hard to credit their view of medicine. Accurate information seems, after all, so much more real than wisdom. Hippocrates knew nothing about so elementary a fact as the circulation of the blood. He thought of blood as a pure vehicle for the elements of creation, earth, air, fire, and water, and he held that the purest blood must reside nearest the heart, the seat of the purest affections. He and his contemporaries argued whether consciousness could be located in the brain or the bloodstream. Choosing one or the other put you in entirely different camps of Greek medicine. This seems like a ridiculously primitive disagreement, but the ancient physicians collectively held on to some invaluable assumptions that no one debated. They assumed that man and the entire world were endowed with life, intelligence, and a soul. Since they believed that every bit of the living world contributed to human well-being for better or worse, the ancients built their centers of medicine at sites of great beauty and sanctity. A hospital was very much like a temple. Patients came for inner as well as outer restoration, and their physicians found the fresh air and sunlight to be highly beneficial for them both. In his counsel to doctors, Hippocrates wrote one great dictum: nature is the curer of sickness. His famed center of medicine on the island of Kos was reputed to contain 6,000 medicinal plants, but he knew stronger remedies than any of them. Leave your drugs in the pot at the pharmacy if you cannot cure the patient with food. His complete trust in nature sounds radical now, but if he turned out to be right, wouldn't we all feel nothing less than immense relief? The ancients proposed that nature, meaning our own inner nature, had sufficient means to keep us completely healthy. Their ideal was a state of health that harbored no thoughts of sickness at all. In other words, health was like freedom. A free life did not confine itself to boundaries and precautions. It was lived spontaneously, taking its nourishment from air, sun, food, and philosophy. And the more spontaneous it could be, the stronger it stood. Nothing in our medical system comes close to this sort of inspiration. In exchange for ideal health, we accept a view that is more practical, and so we say more rational. Our science attempts to understand the body one piece at a time, in terms of cells, tissues, and organs. It protects our health the same way, one disease at a time. But a rational system can wander so far from the source of its inspiration that it turns back on itself. I had lunch once with the Dean of Social Medicine at a prestigious medical school. We had not met before, and this talk was at my request. I was proposing to him that a conference be held at his school on the medicine of the East, which are the last repositories for the old ideal of man in harmony with nature. The Dean was a physician, an expert in diseases on the larger social scale, including the Far East, but he was skeptical about what I proposed. He adamantly declared that he could not understand why anyone praised Eastern medicine, whose concepts were utterly mumbo-jumbo as far as he could tell. He complained, "I've heard from Eastern doctors, and their heads are filled with mystical ideas. We won't have to listen to all this mystical rubbish, will we?" That I was from India and might have a personal stake in such ideas didn't faze him. I responded to him a bit coolly. The belief that man and nature are bound up together in one body is part of these systems. It's not some kind of mystical nonsense. They have found therapies that work as well as ours. It's just a different basic concept. Our medicine is based on a concept too, as you know. He snorted. He also made the memorable remark, "For God's sake, if you do hold this conference, don't let me hear from those holistic health people. I've got enough trouble from them already." The Dean glared down at his luncheon plate, probably thinking about the holistic menace. No one who really believed in the medicine he practices could be that aggressively close-minded. After we parted, I became angry that his attitude had forced me to act like an enemy to real medicine. His sort of real medicine has its glaring faults, though not mystical ones. It's not news that confidence in doctors is becoming rare. The incredible expense and complexity of the present system is known to everybody. What is less well known, because doctors do not discuss it very openly, is the futility of practicing medicine without a basic ideal. What kind of holistic rubbish would the Dean have found in these two lines? "Rejoice at your inner powers, for they are the makers of wholeness and holiness in you. Rejoice at seeing the light of day, for seeing makes truth and beauty possible." They happen to come from Hippocrates, and as long as they have meaning, medicine is saved from being soulless. I was probably lucky to go through a dark night in New Jersey. In a moment of insecurity, I felt that not the physician, but the disease had the upper hand. My rational methods, the machines I controlled, and my concepts of treatment seemed to have too little to do with life and too much to do with death. Practicing medicine as we do now makes a doctor's life as nerve-wracking as a soldier's. It consists of an endless struggle to conquer disease, and to keep at this, a doctor must deny to himself that disease ultimately wins. If you feel called to practice medicine, these are not the kinds of thoughts you permit yourself. But doctors do face up to them from time to time and wonder what the work is for. After my troubled night, I became what I was headed for. I got to be a resident and a specialist. Like the big third-year man who urged me on to Boston, I became a chief resident myself, and so I got used to being right. The dormitories of large teaching hospitals became a second home to me. In time, I had my own practice. Success in the system, however, depended on believing in the system. I used to be much better at that than I am now. My beliefs have been changing very fast, and now I'm part of the Dean's holistic menace. I am amazed at how long it took me to discover something that is almost absurdly simple. A physician must trust in nature and be happy in himself. But when you're starting out in New Jersey, it takes time to rejoice at your inner powers. I mentioned earlier that my father was a physician in India. How he became one and how that affected my life is a story worth telling. My father began his career in medicine as a medical officer in the army that fought the Japanese in Burma during World War II. At one point, my father was called away from the front. News had come that Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India under King George VI, was arriving for a tour of the subcontinent, and his usual medical aid was unavailable. My father was assigned to that duty on short notice. What it entailed, I don't exactly know. My father made it sound as if he stood at attention to hand Lady Mountbatten her aspirin when she arose in the morning. Whatever he did, the Viceroy and his wife were suitably impressed, and at the end of the tour asked my father what he wanted out of life. On an impulse, my father said, "I want to train in internal medicine." Lord Mountbatten immediately issued the orders, from which sprang a letter conveying my father to the British hospital in Pune. When he arrived, the medical officer in charge looked at him flatly and said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Every patient, every doctor, every staff member in the hospital was white. My father looked conspicuously out of place. My father replied, "I'm here to learn medicine," and presented his letter from Lord Mountbatten. The chief of medicine took one look and said, "All right, show up on rounds tomorrow." Grand rounds under the British were ceremonies of considerable occasion. Every doctor showed up. For 2 months my father remained silent on these morning rituals of visiting each patient. One day the group came across a case where no one could state an opinion about a diagnosis. My father had studied each case day in and day out, and half of each night to be sure he would never make a mistake. This time, when even the chief of medicine was stymied, my father blurted out his opinion. As it happened, he was right. From that point on, the eminent chief of medicine became interested in Christian Chopra, and one day called him into his office. Again my father was unexpectedly asked, "What do you want?" He was just as unprepared as before, but he found himself answering that he wanted to specialize in cardiology. The chief saw that my father deserved success and invited him to come and study in London. My father left his family in the care of his own father while he went to Britain to study. The old man, my grandfather, had developed a severe heart condition. For relief, he turned to the herbs and practices of Ayurveda. When my father heard of this, he demanded that my grandfather abandon this nonsense and call in a Western-style heart specialist. It was ludicrous and humiliating to him that while he was training as a cardiologist, his father went to native doctors. I am too far removed now to know if my grandfather was sustained by his trust in Ayurvedic physicians and if it helped his condition. I do know that he called in the heart specialist, dutifully took the prescribed drugs, and died 2 weeks later. My father took this as a terrible blow and immediately returned to us in India, accepted a teaching position, and forgot his life in the great medical centers of London. If anybody thought that grandfather had been doing better under the care of Ayurveda than under the heart specialist, we never whispered it to my father. It would not have occurred to anyone of his generation that there might be a marriage between Ayurveda and modern scientific medicine. As my father's son, I was an unlikely person to rediscover Ayurveda for myself. It required the intervention of a new force in my life. When it arrived, which I will tell you about a bit later, the appeal of Ayurvedic wisdom became self-evident. The idea of a medicine that keeps man whole became tremendously welcome after all. Very few of us realize the stupendous view of human potential that is India's ancient bequest to humanity. At the soul of India, there is an expansive spiritual joy. Ayurvedic medicine is completely a part of this view, and therefore its aim is the constant expansion of man's happiness. The two Sanskrit words, Ayus meaning life and Veda meaning knowledge, form the word Ayurveda, the traditional medicine of India. Even when I was ignorant of any good that might come from Ayurveda and completely captivated by the West, I knew a famous verse from the Ayurvedic text that declared Ayurveda is for immortality. In another place, the text says, the inner intelligence of the body is the ultimate and supreme genius. It mirrors the wisdom of the universe. Because Ayurveda springs from deep sources, it has outlasted India's sad decline under 2 centuries of British rule. To this day, Ayurveda constitutes 70% of healthcare in the country, but principally in the rural areas, where the poor cannot be reached by our new and enlightened medicine. According to the sacred text known as the Charak Samhita, there was an ancient era when the people of India had fallen prey to sickness and spiritual ignorance. 7 of the greatest rishis or seers took pity on them and asked the gods for help. They sat together in a circle, meditating deeply, and summoned Indra, who is the manifestation of everything in creation. One of the rishis, Bhardwaj, sat outside the circle to receive Indra's complete knowledge about life. This was not just man's life, but the lives of animals and plants, stones and atoms, and indeed everything that could be said to have a lifespan in the plan of creation. This knowledge, encompassing time from the smallest part of a split second to the age of the cosmos, was Ayurveda. The rishis gave it to the people to be applied to themselves and saved forever. Thus Ayurveda signifies more than a system of medicine. It is India's guide to life. Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali writer, touched upon this tradition in a passage devoted to the true Indian view of the world. For us, the highest purpose of the world is not merely living in it, knowing it and making use of it, but realizing our own selves in it through expansion of sympathy, comprehending and uniting ourselves with it in perfect union. In our family, the idea of resorting to traditional Ayurveda with its thousands of unproven herbs and even more of its pointless rituals was heresy. My father proudly practiced Western medicine and looked on his accomplishments as a personal triumph. He had every reason to think that modern India would be well off without the ignorant old ways. Ayurveda, being unscientific to Western eyes, would join the other cast-offs. It never occurred to me or to my father that Ayurveda might be something great. The heart of its essential truth is that man must live in the stream of nature and balance his life as nature demands. Nature is the curer of illness. All healing in the ancient world, from Greece to India to China, derived from this ancient precept. But Ayurveda goes on to restore man as a lord of life. This is a key understanding. As is the atom, so is the universe. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. This is a hard thing to come to terms with. Our worst fear is that one day we will encounter our own genius. To be really fearless, humans would have to be on par with Indra, the wholeness of creation. But in the human mind, nature has set us apart. Man has made himself a half-god in a world where perfect godliness is forbidden. The laws invoked by Ayurveda can make or unmake our joys and fears. They are almost entirely personal. They live in our hearts. They rule our awareness. The time-honored precepts of Ayurveda are in no way peculiar. Ayurveda mandates cleanliness and hygiene, pure food and water, and balanced nutrition. They also include the use of natural medicines found in plants. I think certain of the women in our immediate household, and certainly all the older generation when I was growing up, gave credence to Ayurveda. I remember one day my brother Sanjeev and I were playing with a BB gun my father had brought us from London. Sanjeev was shooting target practice against a post. I moved behind the post and he asked me to go away. But in school the Christian brothers had just taught us about William Tell. I told Sanjeev we should play that game. Reluctantly, he fired at me, trying to hit the post above my head. Unfortunately, he missed, and the BB hit me right on the point of my chin. Blood began to flow. Sanjeev was terribly upset, and although I tried to reassure him that I was not badly hurt, it took a great deal of persuasion to keep him from running back to the house immediately. When my father came home that evening, we told him that my wound was from a point of barbed wire that I had fallen on while climbing over the fence. He accepted this explanation and applied an antiseptic. That would have been the end of the incident, except that the wound refused to heal. Days passed, and still the spot looked red and swollen, no matter what medicines my father gave me, including injections of antibiotic. My grandmother could stand it no longer. She took me aside and began to rub my chin with turmeric, a common kitchen spice that was one of the Ayurvedic remedies she knew. As she was applying it, she felt a tiny bump and said that something was lodged in my chin. My father couldn't find anything, but grandmother wouldn't relent, insisting that I be taken to the army hospital for x-rays. My father gave in, the pictures were taken, and he was amazed to see that a BB had worked its way deep under the skin. When Sanjeev and I were interrogated again, the strain was too much for him. He confessed what had really happened. My grandmother's stock rose enormously. Before, my father had paid grudging respect whenever she bypassed his medicine to prescribe a little ginger for a cold or some turmeric paste for a sore, because these remedies had an annoying habit of working perfectly. Now he actually began to refer some of his more difficult cases to her at mealtimes. No one outside the family knew that the great doctor respected his mother as a higher authority, but he had to admit more than once her Ayurvedic notions helped his patients. I was a first-year medical student in 1964. Every class lasted 3 semesters, and the hours in class were excruciatingly long. But Professor Nanda, who taught physiology, was a lively and inquisitive man who could teach a student how to detect the 8 phases of a single heartbeat. He had attended a lecture on meditation and had invited a holy Indian man to our class. In the Indian fashion, this man was called saint, but this word is applied to holy men more casually than it is in the West. Professor Nanda was intrigued, not as a devotee of meditation, but as a scientist. He had heard about the remarkable control over the body which advanced practitioners were said to have achieved. He wanted to discover what a saint could accomplish in terms of heartbeat, breathing capacity, and levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. So he asked the man if he could bury him. The saint agreed. The man we buried was dressed in the faded saffron robes of a wandering monk. His matted hair and beard were untrimmed. He'd been exposed to the weather for many years. Professor Nanda placed him in a wooden box, just large enough for him to sit inside in lotus posture. As the top was nailed, we caught a last glimpse of him as he began to meditate. The box was lowered into a pit dug especially for the purpose, and dirt was thrown over the top. Burying a holy man may seem like a particularly Indian thing to do, but the most Indian thing about my medical training was memorization. We spent hundreds of hours at it. In my first 3 semesters, I memorized the human anatomy in endless and useless detail, as every student before had done who survived the rigors of the system. 2 or 3 of us would gather in my room at night, peering at the tiny grooves in every bone of the skeleton I had purchased. Every groove had a name, and we would not be passed on to the next phase of the school until we knew them by heart. Much of our time was spent this way over the course of the next 4.5 years. There were 3 professional phases, lasting 3 terms each. At the end of each phase came along a battery of tests called practical examinations. They were terrifying because they came only once, and if you failed, you were sent back to the same classes in which you had just spent 3 semesters. By the time we came to the end of our 3rd semester of the first phase, we were prepared to write 15-page essays on the course of the radial or ulnar nerve as it ran down the arm. But we had not yet actually seen a living patient. The second professional phase brought, if anything, a heavier burden of memorization than the first. Studying pharmacology was like being lost entirely in a wilderness of words. We memorized the properties of hundreds of drugs, but we never actually saw any of them or administered them to patients. For each drug, say digitalis, we learned the common and pharmaceutical names, the origin, specific action on the heart and other organs, correct dosage, toxicity in animals as well as humans, and a long list of side effects. In the case of digitalis, they began with nausea and ended with death. Pathology turned out to be basically a repeat of physiology, except that instead of looking at healthy tissue through our microscopes, we looked at diseased ones. Following the course from normal, healthy functioning to the slight impairments that finally ended in a breakdown for the cell gave me a deep respect for the subtle causes of illness and the many stages that precede the appearance of symptoms. I found that I could be perfectly happy in a lab. Our next block of finals, the second phase practical examinations, were quite elaborate. They included long essays, personal interviews, multiple choice questions, and verbal examinations by the faculty or viva voces. These vivas were a particular strain on our nerves. Their ritual was absolutely unvarying. A candidate walked into a room where he met his 2 examiners. One was his own professor, who was called the internal examiner. The other was a professor in the same subject, but from another medical school. This person, called the external examiner, routinely tried to fail as many candidates as possible in order to show the superiority of his own university. Conversely, the internal examiner took a protective role with his own pupils. To crown the scene, a row of 10 young postgraduate doctors were lined up behind the examiner's desk. They attended largely in the spirit of having fun at our expense. When I entered the exam room for pharmacology, I saw the external examiner poised with a gulab jamun halfway to his mouth. A gulab jamun is a sweet cake soaked in syrup, provided in an attempt to mollify the visiting professor. This man was more than the usual terror. His table was therefore lined with plates of sweets and little meat-stuffed samosas. As soon as his eye caught me and the poised sweet cake was just going down, he asked, "What is the most serious side effect of INH?" I froze, and my professor turned pale. The external examiner had unexpectedly asked me one of the easiest questions imaginable. INH, or isoniazid, is one of the most common drugs used in India to treat tuberculosis, which is one of the most common diseases there. Even though I had never seen a case of TB, or a dose of INH for that matter, I certainly knew the answer. But I had drawn a blank. I entered these exams with my heart pounding 200 beats a minute and cotton in my mouth. A few missed questions on a viva meant months of wasted labor. I also couldn't help but notice that one of the postgraduate doctors was having what appeared to be a seizure. One side of his face began to twitch and went slack. At about the same time, another postgraduate stuck his arm into the aisle as stiff as a plank, and a third kicked one leg into the air. I knew that they were trying to give me hints, but the message was lost on me. The external examiner cocked an ironic glance at the internal examiner, and I recall that he actually said, "Did this student learn the most common side effect of the most common drug for treating the most common disease in the course?" Or at least we all read his thoughts. Then I blurted out, "Peripheral neuritis, sir." My professor relaxed, and the row of postgraduates returned to health. They had all been mimicking one sort of paralysis or another, which is indeed the worst effect of the drug, a progressive loss of sensation in the limbs that eventually leaves them paralyzed. In my graduation year, school was going very well. By dint of continual grinding, I passed my examinations in the top 5 for every subject except surgery. Now that we were actually involved with patients, I was thriving. I was happily entrenched in the hospital routine, spending every day on the wards. Many of our patients were rural villagers. They came to Delhi for care only as a last resort after the traditional means had failed to cure them. We had absolutely no respect for the folk medicine that the village doctors practiced or that the patient tried on himself. At an Indian medical school, the one thing you are guaranteed not to learn about is Indian medicine. I have not forgotten the saint we buried in my first year physiology class. After 6 days, Professor Nanda met us in the courtyard again, and workmen began to unearth the saint's box. This took almost half an hour while we waited in curious anticipation. The box was lifted out, then the top pried off, and after some minutes, the saint slowly stood up. His eyes were half-lidded. He gave us a little wave, but no smile. The saint was escorted into the physiology lab, where he politely asked for a glass of warm milk. He sipped it calmly as he was hooked up to the various monitors. Professor Nanda had already determined that the pulse and breathing were unusually faint when the saint was immersed in meditation. His heartbeat at first sounded non-existent, but on closer hearing it was in fact fluttering in light, very rapid throbs like a bird's heart. The saint could enter the state at will, as he showed us in the lab. The EKG or electrocardiogram confirmed his heartbeat by faint squiggles traced out on graph paper. Other tests showed a level of reduced oxygen consumption that no bodily mechanism we had studied could account for. The simple fact was that the saint had lived peacefully for 6 days under conditions that would have destroyed a normal mind and body in less than 12 hours. All of us were amazed by this demonstration, but after a week it was forgotten. The saint slowly walked away from our medical school. Within an hour, I'm sure he once again felt the warm sand of pilgrimage beneath his feet. We thus missed a perfect opportunity to ask ourselves what normal really means in the functioning of the human physiology. Studies have repeatedly validated such feats as we witnessed, but the few I have read were dryly clinical in their approach. I suspect that they mirror the same shallow curiosity that we showed. I did not yet realize what deep footprints our saint was leaving behind. It would take 10 years before I had a significant encounter with meditation. I would give a great deal now to know more about the content of that saint's mind and its wisdom, about his soul, the most important thing to him. A deeper silence prevails. In our arrogance, we thought that a saint could be captured on graph paper, but his quiet heart kept its secrets. Salim Khan and I were fledgling doctors, about 23 years old, and assigned together by a medical school to a small village named Ramgarh. It was our responsibility to take care of an entire village. An instructor from the medical school stopped by every 3 or 4 days with supplies, otherwise we were on our own. Ramgarh was little more than a cluster of mud huts surrounded by wheat fields. Our dispensary was built of brick, but like all other buildings, its floor was made of cow and buffalo dung. Dung serves very well as flooring. It is clean enough to use in kitchens. It can be replaced every season with a new surface at no cost, and it greets the nose with a sharp, refreshing smell after it has cured in the hot, dry air. Salim and I had been assigned to a rotation in Ramgarh for 6 months as part of our internship. We had a large enough house, complete with a courtyard and a servant to cook our meals. The work was blissfully easy. For one thing, we had almost no medicines to work with and no equipment at all. We arrived with our black bags, a copy of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, and the usual few pharmaceuticals you take to the countryside: iron pills, anti-tubercular pills, and anti-helminth pills. Helminths are parasitic worms very common to the tropics, but almost unknown in the West. Our villagers showed a very high incidence of tuberculosis. If anyone came to the dispensary looking half dead and wasted, we automatically gave out the anti-tubercular pill and usually an iron pill as well. Most of the villagers did not believe in our prescriptions. They had relied for centuries on other ways, primarily the knowledge of the local Ayurvedic Vaidya. His advice was the ultimate authority, along with the village elders, and his herbs were the ultimate cure. My partner Salim, who was already showing brilliance in microbiology, was not suited for village life. He hated the absence of air conditioning and the unbearable heat. So did I, and the feeble twinkling electricity. He hated the ignorance of the farmers, who preferred to call in a grandmother and a midwife when a baby was due, rather than a doctor, and who stubbornly rejected our explanations about germs because they all knew that people got sick because demons got into them. But a village posting is a perfect place to decelerate from the grind of medical school. Salim and I liked nothing better than to lie in the courtyard in the late afternoon. The radio would be tuned in to the cricket matches between Australia and India. Our last days of school were behind us. By any standard, we were modern physicians. Therefore, by Indian standards, we were absolutely elite physicians. To be a graduate of the All India Medical Institute carried enormous prestige. None of that seemed very significant, however, once you left Delhi behind. Now that we were in Ramgarh, it meant nothing. If anything, what we noticed was how much our professors had failed to tell us. The visiting lecturers from the West had everything to say about the latest modality for treating arthritis or chronic depression, as taught at Yale or Johns Hopkins. Cholera, however, is not commonly seen at either Yale or Johns Hopkins, so lectures on that subject are scarce. But cholera is never absent for long from India, and it rages fitfully into fearsome epidemics. It was the summer of 1969 when we were posted to Ramgarh. One day Salim had taken a short break to go to Delhi to remind himself that air conditioning still existed. I couldn't blame him. The temperature was 120 degrees almost every day. Our assistant Ghanshyam came into my room almost hysterical. "Dr. Sahib must come quick," he exclaimed. "The village elder has a grandson who has just gone mad." He kept muttering, "He's gone mad, he's gone mad," as we both ran to the village elder's compound. Inside the house, when we arrived, stood a group of people. The village elder approached, a dignified old man in his 70s with a pointed beard. He talked to me in an assured voice. The boy's all right now. It was too much heat. He's still out of his head, but I'm sure he'll be all right when he's cooler. He thinks there are men on the moon. He invited me to look at the boy. I found him in the next room, lying naked on the bare floor, while two women, probably his mother and aunt, lightly sponged him with cold water. He was about 12 years old. He looked comfortable, though my hand came away from his forehead, a little hot. He has a little delirium, I told his grandfather when I came out. He may say strange things for a while. It's common with heat stroke. The elder man repeated, he thinks there are men on the moon, and shook his head. That evening, when I turned on the radio for the cricket scores, I heard some news. The Americans had landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong had taken the first step. Pictures were coming back on TV. The next morning, I went back to the village elder's house and told him the boy was right. Indeed, there were men on the moon. The elder was shocked. After convening the village council to discuss the matter, he came back to me and said, "It may still be that you are mistaken. We only hope that nothing bad comes out of this foolishness." A little while later, I discovered that the elder's grandson had heard about the moon landing when he walked to the nearby city of Ghaziabad that morning, and also happened to take too much sun. I did not learn much about Ayurveda in Ramgarh. I learned a lot, however, about what medical care has to be. It has to suit the people a doctor cares for. It has to agree with their temperaments and what they expect from life. It must be affordable and humane, and it must work. It never occurred to me that Ayurveda would work in its present form, although it blends in with the daily traditions and common beliefs of the people. The way of the Vaidya seems greatly diluted from what it once must have been. In the ancient times, Ayurvedic doctors were paid only if they kept the people well, which they managed to do for thousands of years. But that era is far removed from India of recent centuries. The ancient texts of Ayurveda reveal an astonishing sophistication. Sushruta, the paramount authority on surgery, tells us explicitly about his techniques and even provides pictures of his tools. They look almost exactly like the scalpels and retractors of modern surgeons. Sushruta used to take the heart-shaped leaves of the peepal tree and fashion them into models of noses. When one of these models satisfied him, he went to work. Sushruta possessed the skill to rebuild damaged or even lost noses. This delicate and painstaking procedure, called a rhinoplasty, does not reappear in medicine until modern plastic surgery. Sushruta's reputation still runs so high that American plastic surgeons have a society that goes by his name. Sushruta also knew about the circulation of the blood. He could keep wounds from becoming septic. He submerged cadavers in clear running streams and observed the fine details of anatomy as the water sloughed off layers of tissue. He seems in every respect to embody the deepest inquisitive spirit of a researcher and also a physician's most knowing skills. When exactly he lived is a matter for argument, but apparently it was many centuries before the birth of Christ. There is something far more important about Sushruta than his position in the annals of the history of medicine. Few doctors, even among those who have heard of him, realize that his celebrated discourse on surgery comes at the end of his book, the Sushruta Samhita. He had far greater knowledge than just that. He understood every possible aspect of the art of healing which means that he understood every aspect of man. He was like Hippocrates, an angelic doctor. After many chapters on the spirit of healing, on medicines to extract from plants, on purifying diets and correct habits, Sushruta finally arrives at surgery only as the physician's last resort. After the doctor has failed, he must rely on surgery. Sushruta bequeathed to Ayurveda a view that man is infinite in scope. He himself had a mind that displayed infinite qualities. More than a physician, he was a Rishi, a seer. He had looked as deeply into nature as our spirit can. Only then did he turn to ordinary work. Motivated by his own perfection, he approached patients not as victims of malady, but as people who could potentially perfect themselves too. That aspiration lies at the core of Ayurveda. And of course, it is not seen, not on a large scale in India today. India is too poor, too wretched, too afraid of the next epidemic that might sweep down the rivers. Sushruta and his perfection are as far away in time as the moon is in space. But there is gravity to keep the moon from ever really escaping, and the same is true of Ayurveda. As tenuous as it may appear to us, the core of Ayurveda has not been lost. It may be that its most wonderful flowering has yet to occur. I have met the Vaidyas and the modern Rishis who give me hope, more than hope. The potential is there for transforming the face of medicine entirely, and not just in India. All that is needed is to accept the possibility that such a change can take place, then to reach the depths where transformation is effortless and most powerful. Our servants wait on us, but they wait inside. Teilhard de Chardin gave us a wonderful glimpse of our future state. The day will come when, after harnessing the winds, the tides and gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. It can be very confusing to tell health from sickness. In 1971, I was at the end of my internship in New Jersey and ready for a 2-year residency in internal medicine. My sights were still fixed on Boston, in particular on a prestigious private hospital that is commonly referred to as the Mayo Clinic of the East. As an intern, my salary had been only $200 a month, but as a resident, I could expect to make $500. I would be able to afford an apartment and the lowliest of cars. My wife Rita had also become pregnant 3 months after we settled in America. We were overjoyed. I borrowed a friend's VW Bug and chugged up to Boston to interview with the prestigious clinic. It was established in a grand dowager of a brick building on one of the most high-toned stretches of Commonwealth Avenue. The shaded lane of oak trees outside was very unlike the parking lot in New Jersey. As soon as my shoes touched the carpet inside, I knew that no more local mafioso checking for relatives with bullet wounds would be frightening me when they came on their nightly check of the emergency room. A new stratum of American society was opening up to me. The interview went beautifully. The chief of medicine in my community hospital liked my work and wanted to do anything he could to keep me on. He said so in his recommendation, and the prestigious clinic must have been impressed. They wanted me. It was going to be a big jump. I started work the next day in Boston. Patients who came to this clinic had either very rare diseases or very full wallets. My instructions were to be very gentle with all of them. I had landed myself in the hospital equivalent of the most expensive and exclusive French restaurant. But serious medicine, the highest caliber of medicine in fact, was being practiced. I also quickly discovered the tricky business of telling sickness from health. One of my first revelations of this came early. I was told to work up a physical on a prominent man who routinely came to the clinic once a year. He was due in at 5 that afternoon, but by 9 o'clock I was still waiting, quite unhappy. At last I was told that he was in his room. It was one of the nicest rooms, and a prominent decoration in it was a bouquet of flowers with greetings from President Nixon. As I walked down the hall, I could hear loud wheezing. It sounded very alarming to me, so I rushed into the room. What I saw appalled me. The man was enormous. He weighed at least 250, if not 300 pounds. His feet were grotesquely swollen. His puffy red face gave out gasps with every breath. He apologized for being late, but his jet had had to be refurbished. He had barely enough time to get here after delivering the commencement address at a huge state university in the south. I didn't know anything about a life like his, nothing about vital all-night negotiations or what it meant to control millions of votes, which they said he did. As I took his medical history, it was clear that I was seeing a seriously sick man. He worked 20 hours a day, he proudly informed me. For years his habit had been to smoke 3 packets of cigarettes a day. Since he liked scotch, he allowed himself to drink it whenever he wanted. At present, he put back a bottle and a half every day. When I examined him, I discovered with no great surprise that he had advanced cirrhosis of the liver and several of the complications that accompany gross overweight. I asked him how he felt. "Great," he shot back. "Never felt better. Never get sick either." "Really?" I said in amazement. He looked at me a little more closely. "You know, I just come here every year for my checkup, just to make sure I'm still okay." "I am, aren't I?" I got out of there somehow and went to consult my attending physician. He immediately asked, "My God, you didn't say anything to him, did you?" I said that I didn't know what to tell him. Naturally, I thought he should immediately stop drinking and smoking. If he stayed in the clinic on a monitored diet, we might be able to reverse some of his damaged functions as his weight came down. The liver, of course, would not regenerate. My chief didn't pause. "Don't tell him anything like that. He'll go into DTs if we take away his scotch. He's been living this way for 40 years. Who knows what keeps him going? We don't. He's extremely powerful, and if he got this far, it's ridiculous to change him until he at least realizes that there is something wrong." As I left, he said, "Remember, you must be gentle with these patients." The attending physician knew what he was talking about. Whenever we told patients that they should mend their ways, stop drinking, quit smoking, lose 40 pounds, get off sleeping pills and Valium, they looked very unhappy. They were what they were, and they didn't want to change. We felt very frustrated. We knew what was good for these people, but we were pouring water into broken pots. Every day we also saw patients, most of them women, who came to us complaining of weakness and loss of energy. For many of them, this had become a way of life. They felt vaguely depressed all the time. Most of them were overweight. The only difference between them and the patients seen in every doctor's office was that some of these women came from the richest families in America. They showed up on the doorstep of this prestigious clinic because it was famous for treating extremely rare diseases. It was one of the main reasons that top doctors joined the staff. For any doctor who had fallen in love with a rare diagnosis, this was a perfect place to observe fascinating syndromes that one never runs across in a general practice. Since treatments were often of the utmost delicacy, there were only a handful of places in the country that could offer care like ours. The bulk of our patients, 99 out of 100, did not suffer from such disorders, but many hoped that they did. My own field of endocrinology was ripe for this, since the common symptoms of insomnia, lassitude, and obesity can be, but almost never are, indications of an underlying pathology, such as a tumor of the pituitary or the pancreas. I therefore saw my share of female patients who lived on the fantasy that they had a gland problem. Perhaps they had even been right in their nightmares all along. It was cancer. I was discovering the other side of the story from the physician who grows into the habit of seeing his patients as diseases. These women longed to be seen as diseases. They were suffering the dread of having no name for what was wrong with them. If we said that what was wrong didn't have a name, they felt let down, even cheated. They were paying thousands of dollars to be told that they were sick. If only they could be correctly diagnosed, then the responsibility for making them well shifted to their doctors. Being told they were not victims of a disease meant that they were on their own again. I became so tense about their reactions that I developed a little rap for them. As soon as I walked into the room, I would say, "Great news, you don't have hypoglycemia, you don't have hypothyroidism, your pituitary is not out of whack, and your endocrine profile conclusively proves that you don't have cancer of the pancreas. You are very lucky." This subterfuge might have helped my nerves a little, but the patients knew I was telling them the worst. They were physically well. They looked back at me unhappily, and their faces fell. We both knew they needed a solution, but standard American medicine did not extend one to them. They came to us because they believed in the system, but the system wasn't letting them in. When one asks, how shall we improve the system, they are really only asking about two people, a doctor and a patient. When they meet, they have a personal exchange, with the doctor playing one part and the patient the other. If the exchange turns out well, you have the practice of medicine. If it turns out badly, you have problems. Patients who want to be seen as diseases all too often find doctors who will oblige them. It takes both sides to keep the cycle of disease and cure going, but I think the primary responsibility lies with the doctors. I heard a story about one doctor who grew sick of seeing his patients as diseases. Looking at his caseload, he saw that only about 20% of his patients with serious disease, such as malignancy, responded to treatment. With these 20%, he could expect a measure of success. The remaining patient load, far and away the majority, responded to him with dread. They regarded their situation with fear and hopelessness. Although as a physician he played the part of curer, his treatments lacked that all-important ingredient, the patient's confidence in his or her own strength to recover. The doctor looked inside himself and discovered in a moment of exceptional clarity that maybe he was keeping his patients sick. By seeing them as diseases, perhaps he was fostering a disease system, and beyond that, a diseased world. Like a spider in its web, he gave off something sticky that entrapped his patients. Many physicians haven't gotten this far in their thinking, but they don't see how much they can change the system. This doctor knew he was right, and he knew he had a lot more to offer his patients as people than he ever did when he saw them as diseases. So he took a positive step. He wrote a letter to each of his patients and said something like this: "I want you all to be perfectly healthy. Come to me now while you're well, and let's discuss together how we can preserve your health. Don't look at me as an authority who has magic powers. Don't depend on me to be the mechanic for fixing your damaged bodies. I have changed. I regard you all as intimately connected with me in the workings of the entire universe. Together we can discover the perfect healer in each of you. I don't want to be a mechanic anymore. I don't want you to fear me. Share your lives with me, and we can put an end to this terrible inheritance of disease that makes our lives so threatening. Peace." Soon he got responses to his letter. For every 100 he sent out, about 20 patients responded. They were the same 20% who knew how to get well in the first place. He went on to have great experiences with them, teaching them about inner healing and holistic medicine, but he hadn't really changed the system. I think I know why the 80% who did not respond were not able to benefit. Insight couldn't help them when it was another person's insight. A great teacher has called this the tragedy of knowledge. No matter how much water pours from a spring, It can't be carried away in broken pots. A doctor cannot make his patients well by telling them the glories of wholeness and health. Bringing medicine back to a more natural condition is important. The basic unit of medicine is natural after all. A person in trouble seeking help from someone who knows the cure. Leaving medical technology aside, this relationship will always be best when it is simplest and therefore most natural. A story is told about Charaka, the greatest exponent of Ayurveda, who wanted a position as physician to the king. He presented himself at court and asked for the appointment. The king looked at him and said, "But I already have 100 physicians. Why would I want another one?" Charak replied, "You need only one in the first place, if he knows more about medicine than the 100. Charak then challenged the 100 court physicians to pose questions to him. If he answered them all correctly, then he in turn would ask them only one question. He said he didn't think all their knowledge together could answer his one question. The royal Vaidyas were angry at Charaka's audacity, so they asked him question after question about anatomy, pathology, herbs, diet and surgery. Finally, there was nothing more to ask. Charak knew everything about Ayurveda that they did. Then Charak asked his one question. What two medicines are good for all diseases, can be prescribed to every man in every time and place, and cost nothing? The royal Vaidyas had no reply because they had already exposed everything they knew. The answer, declared Charaka, is simple: a walk in the early morning and sunlight. The tale records that the king was so delighted with his answer that he fired his physicians and hired Charaka on the spot. He was a wise king. Any doctor who points the way to nature has found the source of health. Sunshine and a walk in the early morning may seem like primitive remedies to us, but perhaps that shows how far we have to go toward becoming gods. I spent 2 years at the prestigious clinic, happy to further my career. I still burned to get ahead, and as much as the next person, I was in love with a rare diagnosis. Endocrinology posed a tremendous intellectual challenge from the start. Another phase of my life was beginning at the same time. Within 3 days of starting on the job at the clinic, I received the most joyous news. Rita had had our baby, my daughter, my Malika. During the middle and late 70s, I was preoccupied with building my own private practice in Boston. My patient load grew larger and larger, and in time I became affiliated with half a dozen hospitals. I knew that my medical antecedents were exotic in certain ways, but that was well suppressed. In my own mind, I had joined the mainstream of modern medicine. Little did I know that there was a grassroots protest building, headed by patients who felt alienated by the drift toward technology, a grassroots movement that I would become part of. I had started out treating Indian villagers who could never have adapted to healthcare by machine. Naively, I assumed that Americans must be different. Most of them seemed amazingly willing to bend to the system, and those who could not bend managed to be fairly unobtrusive for a time. What I recognize now is that every patient is really a villager at heart, lost and afraid when he or she comes in contact with doctors, but willing to trust in medicine if they feel that the physician cares. If patients feel misused, however, then their shock of disturbance will ripple through all of medicine. And that, of course, is what began to happen. Patients began to teach me that there had to be a new trend towards simplicity and human contact. One of my teachers was a young woman with asthma. I followed her for about 3 years from the time she was 25. Since childhood, she had suffered from mild bronchial asthma, usually not requiring any treatment. Her attacks were almost always brought on by emotional upset. At one point, this woman went through a fairly traumatic divorce, and her asthma responded by becoming worse, with more frequent and more severe episodes. She made several trips to my office for treatment. Noticing that she came in upset, I usually could relieve her symptoms simply by placing her in a quiet room and asking her to relax. Sometimes I added a mild bronchial dilator, not much stronger than those she could buy in a drugstore. I also suggested that she learn meditation as a relaxation technique. She was reluctant to agree. One weekend, when she had a particularly heated argument over the phone with her estranged husband, she felt the onset of an attack. As she became progressively shorter of breath, she called my office. She was told that I could not see her, I was out of town for the day. But if she could wait a few minutes, the covering physician would call her back with some advice. She began to feel panicky, which only made it harder for her to breathe. She decided to drive to the nearest emergency room, about 15 minutes away. Unfortunately, an accident had occurred on the highway, causing a traffic jam. The woman's anxiety increased, and her bronchial spasms grew worse. Her breathing was now very labored, coming in fitful, shallow gasps. Her heart began to pound, and she felt so dizzy she feared losing control of the car. She rummaged desperately through her purse for a pill. A psychiatrist had prescribed some Valium for her during the period of her divorce. The last two were in her purse. She swallowed them both. They didn't help. The dizziness grew worse, and she began to feel drowsy. With great effort, she finally managed to get to the hospital. Then she passed out in the parking lot. The Valium had obviously depressed her respiratory center and made her condition even worse. 2 paramedics discovered her slumped over the wheel of her car. She was unconscious. Her face had turned blue, and they could detect very little spontaneous breathing. The intern in the emergency room was fresh out of Harvard Medical School and primed for aggressive intervention. 5 minutes after her arrival, he had measured her arterial blood gases and ordered an intravenous solution with large amounts of antibiotics, bronchodilators, and corticosteroids. It wasn't actually clear which of these drugs she needed, but in an emergency it is standard to use the shotgun approach and hope that something works. He inserted a tube into her lungs and put her on a respirator to enable her to breathe. Then she was transferred to intensive care. When I checked in a day later, she was still on the respirator, but a complication had set in. The tube in her throat had irritated her so much that she coughed up gastric juice from her stomach and then aspirated it, that is, breathed it into her lungs. As a result, she developed aspiration pneumonia. An infectious disease consultant was called in, and he prescribed a more powerful broad-spectrum antibiotic. Another try with the shotgun. In 3 days, the pneumonia began to clear up. However, because of the patient's general debility, aggravated by high doses of antibiotics, combined with the steroids, a life-threatening fungal infection set in called moniliasis. This frequently develops in people whose immune system has been so drastically compromised. In essence, the drugs the woman was put on had knocked out her pneumonia, but at the cost of knocking out much of the rest of her own immune defenses. She went into septic shock, her blood pressure dropped, and her awareness became feeble and unclear. More consultants were called in. She was seen by a neurologist because of her worsening mental status, by a nephrologist because of her deteriorating kidney function. This had occurred after her blood pressure dropped, by a pulmonologist because of her worsened lung function, and by a cardiologist because of an irregular heartbeat that resulted from inadequate oxygen in her blood. She underwent electrocardiograms, pulmonary function tests, a brain scan, and electroencephalography. She was tested for blood gases and daily changes in her body chemistry. She lay in her bed with catheters inserted into her heart, her bladder, her pulmonary blood vessels, and her lungs. She was finally weaned off the respirator after about 2 weeks. She felt extremely depressed, so a psychiatrist put her on antidepressants. She was counseled by a social worker who only increased her anxiety and anger. We tried hard to cut down her medications, but to no avail. An asthma attack would flare up every time we decreased even one of the drugs. This woman was finally discharged from the hospital a month after she arrived. Her bill totaled about $30,000. She then went home on disability. Her medications consisted of 2 bronchodilators, an antidepressant, another aerosol bronchodilator in case of attacks, corticosteroids, multivitamins, and a tranquilizer. All of these, with the possible exception of the vitamins, caused her to endure multiple side effects, including muscle wasting and osteoporosis, which is a thinning of the bones. The steroids alone caused or contributed to numerous conditions: diabetes, abnormal fat distribution, a tendency to bruise easily due to weakened blood vessels, and worsening depression. If the diabetes is not carefully monitored, she looks forward in the long run to developing disease in her kidneys, vascular system, and heart. If the diabetes becomes serious enough, she may go blind. After these events, she no longer considered me her physician because, as she put it when I last saw her, I need medicine, not advice. She now changes doctors the way most women change dresses. Each one generally gives her a new medicine, usually to offset the adverse effects of the old ones. It is almost too cruel to describe this case, much less to comment on it. The term iatrogenic disease was coined for illness brought on by the physician in his attempt to heal. But how well can any phrase denote such suffering? It is a doctor's shame. Yet every physician in clinical practice has seen such patients. When they come in sick, he or she does the routine things: a diagnosis, a test, a prescription. They become sicker. So the doctor steps up their medication and orders a battery of tests. But the new tests and the stronger medication don't help. Nothing helps. The illness will not respond, and complications begin to develop, growing worse the harder the physician struggles to find a cure. At a certain point, the doctor senses the worst. He tells himself that this one is sliding away, like a climber on a glass mountain. His only consolation is to tell himself that after all, he did the right thing. But the sum total of so many right things was a disaster. What can doctors do in such cases, considering that these situations are unpredictable? There are really only 2 answers: develop more cures or develop fewer cases. My own preference by now should be obvious. Doctors already spend years learning to tell which corticosteroid or antibiotic to prescribe. They can offer patients the miracle of a coronary bypass graft, knowing full well that the last miracle incurred too many problems. It is absolutely certain that in time the current miracle will do the same. It is just now that we are waking up from a delusion. All medical care is not disease and cure. The reality of disease processes is different and much simpler from what older generations thought it was. Disease starts out humbly in the body as some imperceptible imbalance and proceeds slowly from there. The outcome of a full-blown disease may be devastating, but it has been built up through insignificant everyday actions. What we eat and drink, how we behave, how our emotions affect us. These are small things. When they support well-being, we don't give them a second thought. But no action is lost in the body. We are always building. Every bite of food, every breath, every thought is like laying a brick, even if we aren't aware that we are the building. If I could turn back the clock, my young asthma patient would not have reached the point of crisis. She would have been educated from the start about the causes that precipitate her illness. She would have been told that her emotions played a critical part, knowing that she would have relied on breathing exercises, relaxation, and even meditation rather than a squeeze from her plastic bottle of bronchodilator. If she had been reached early as a child, she would not have been overwhelmed by her attacks. When one began to set in, she would have drunk an herbal tea that acts as a mild bronchodilator but has no side effects and no risk of dependency. She would have also known how to go inward to direct her attention in a therapeutic way. She would have felt confident rather than panicky, which makes a critical difference in asthma. A poised self-control would be her strongest defense. Her doctor would have also pointed out the daily routines, exercise, rest, sleeping habits that reduce attacks to a minimum. Added to that would have been a special diet suited to asthmatics. Over time, the diet and the daily routine would have readjusted her physiology and brought it back from the specific imbalance that causes asthma. Her doctor's most important advice, however, would have been that she was responsible for her own condition. She could choose the affirming attitudes that promote health. She could live without fear. By turning back the clock, I am giving this woman a different existence, but I would also have to orient her to a different medicine. Doctors do not know asthma from the side of well-being, only from the side of disease. The herbs, daily routine, exercises, meditation and diet I described do not exist in modern medicine. They do exist in Ayurveda. That is one of its great contributions. Ayurveda also teaches that the subtlest changes are just the ones that can be the most powerful. The amount of adrenaline it takes to make you jump away from a snake on the path is extremely minute. It would sit comfortably in a little droplet on the head of a pin. When the Ayurvedic texts prescribe delicate measures for a disease, such as a few herbs and a carefully modified diet, it is because they want the action to be subtle. They are heading directly to the level of physiological functioning that is most powerful. These measures do not necessarily work to combat full-blown diseases, but the answer, as I would have wished for my asthma patient, is to start the treatment before the critical stage. After I moved to America, I made regular visits back to India. One such visit was in 1981, and when I stepped off the plane, the heat seemed, as usual, unbearable. Getting off the plane in summer is like turning into a tandoori chicken, and I hate it. The tandoor is a local type of clay oven which is fired so hot that as soon as a scrawny Indian chicken is thrust in, it roasts almost immediately. The chicken comes out bright pink, like the tender Americans when they step off the plane in summer. So the comparison is not bad. My friend Farooq had invited me to meet someone he thought I would appreciate. Our scooter rickshaw took us as far as it could in an old Muslim section of Delhi where tiny crooked streets turned into rutted gullies. Farooq and I negotiated the nearest ravine. It ran like all the other ones, higgledy-piggledy, into a chaotic group of houses, mosques and tombs. We talked about meditation along the way, watched where we were stepping, and ignored the cows. Farooq thoroughly understood meditation. It was an interest I had just picked up. He talked about it in terms of quantum physics and chemistry and depth psychology in the modern way. But he also has a soul of light. Farooq is a Parsi, one of a devout sect in India which began in Persia hundreds of generations ago. Its great prophet is Zoroaster, and its three most famous adherents in the Western view are the Magi who followed the star to Bethlehem. Farooq greatly interested me. He has a wonderful mind. He went to England to retrain in the law, did brilliantly there, and on his return home became counsel to the Supreme Court of India. But soon after he was called to the bar, he gave it all up to devote himself to meditation. I must make it clear that he was not renouncing the world. In his view, he was going for a promotion. Meditation is a means to become fully awake. There is a famous Sanskrit verse which says that all the hymns of the Veda come to him who is awake. Since the sacred books of the Veda are said to contain everything, all the hymns of the Veda means all the knowledge in the universe. So you see what Farooq meant by a promotion. I did not know meditation inside out the way Farooq did. But we agreed about it even then, before I knew the major role it was soon to play in my life. This day Farooq was quite excited when I arrived. He wanted me to meet with someone of great renown, said to be the preeminent living Ayurvedic physician. His name was Dr. Brihaspati Dev Triguna, and he was the head of the All India Council for Ayurvedic Physicians. 350,000 physicians looked up to this council from the length and breadth of India. A great sage had even called Dr. Triguna the living incarnation of Ayurveda. This was not taken as simply a flowery embellishment. Trigunaji's great specialty was to gain a full diagnosis of his patients simply by feeling their pulse. Farooq told me, he only has to put 3 fingers on your wrist and he knows your whole medical history, past, present and future. It's called Nadi Vigyan, a very ancient art, and he's a master of it. We must go to see him, Farooq said excitedly. Besides, he's free. I was looking forward to the meeting with anticipation. Farooq and I arrived at the home of Dr. Triguna and found about 50 people waiting in his courtyard to see him. I protested to Farooq that we couldn't just go past these people, and he responded by saying, "Come on, I know Triguna. He loves to see Western doctors." We waited for him to finish with his patient, and then Farooq began to make introductions. "I have brought a great man to see you, Trigunaji. He's a famous doctor in America, one of the most famous. Whatever goes on in the glands of the human body, he knows about it." What was Farooq doing? I tried to make him stop, but he didn't pay any attention. Farooq continued, "People come from everywhere to the great medical center in Boston, where Dr. Chopra is a beacon of wisdom." A little more of this, and when I was thoroughly embarrassed, Farooq turned to me and said, "Now let Trigunaji take your pulse." "No," I protested. Maybe Farooq should have his pulse taken. Farooq looked taken aback. It hadn't occurred to me, after all his build-up, that Farooq had not actually allowed Dr. Triguna to diagnose him. So I insisted, and Farooq timidly put forward a bony wrist. Dr. Triguna touched his pulse for a few seconds, then looked hard at Farooq. "This body, no good," he boomed in English. All the color drained at once from Farooq's face. He pulled back his arm. Dr. Triguna was now shaking his head mournfully. "Vata," he intoned, "is very out of balance. You are too thin. You don't eat. You are weak." I found myself paying attention. The Parsis are a closed group who have bred the same genes cycle after cycle for centuries. They do tend toward weak bodies, a high incidence of certain cancers and thinness. I had always thought Farooq had a starved, sickly body myself. I worried about him physically, but he hadn't taken it to heart. I could see that Farooq was rapidly losing enthusiasm for his great Trigunaji. Triguna continued, "But you can live a long time if you take care of this body. You must eat more slowly. Chew your food and take time to eat. Go to bed on time. Make sure you're rested. Have your meals on time. Sit silently for meditation. Learn to take life more slowly." Farooq seemed to be cheering up. "You will live a long, happy life once your body is better," Dr. Triguna ended, and then he gave specific advice about which diet would help Farooq become stronger. His advice seemed simple, but I felt respect for Dr. Triguna. I agreed with what he had said. Now it was my turn. Dr. Triguna felt my pulse for a few seconds. He looked down. "I will tell you," he said, and then he stopped speaking. "Yes?" I asked as I waited. He repeated more slowly, "I will tell you later." "You can't tell me now?" I asked. He shook his head. I thought perhaps Farooq had made him nervous about my incredible importance. I pressed for more. He had my curiosity up now. Sometime later, Dr. Triguna insisted, "Maybe a few insignificant things for now." He looked at me shrewdly. It was the real physician's examining look, and very deep. "2 things I can tell you now," he said. "You think too many unnecessary thoughts. You are always trying to beat a deadline." He made the points come home somehow. "You have a healthy body, but your life is moving too fast. Thinking too many thoughts leads to high blood pressure. In later life, it can cause heart disease." "And what should I do?" I asked. "Slow down," he responded. There are 4 important things to gain in life: fame, wealth, a happy family life, and spiritual attainment. You are gaining them all, but too fast. If you get them now, what will you do for the rest of your life? It is important that things come at the proper time. You should sit for 5 minutes silently before you go to work in the morning. When there is an opportunity, watch a sunset. It is good for your body type. Spend more time with your wife and children. Chew your food slowly. Make sure you move your bowels at the same time every day. Soak 7 to 10 skinned sweet almonds in a glass of water overnight and eat them in the morning, slowly. As I say them to you, Dr. Triguna's words may seem naive. To me they were not. He seemed to know. I felt relaxed with him, very relaxed, like water flowing between its banks. He thought for a second, and then he told me one last thing. Ayurveda is very clear about the goal of life. It is to be happy and to receive wise and happy thoughts from every part of the universe. It was a pivotal moment for me. I felt as if Dr. Triguna read me well, very well. The common things he said as well as the uncommon things wove themselves into a pattern that described me. They seemed at once right and just. I felt that his simplicity of speech was wise. Yes, if I did these things, I would be all right. There was tremendous reassurance here. Dr. Triguna knew. I thanked him shyly. As I got up to leave, I realized that I was deeply affected. I turned and did something that I would have found ridiculous in the West. I gently touched his feet. It was the same gesture of respect I afforded my grandfather when I was a boy. When we were outside, I felt very grateful to Farooq. He is, as you said, I commented. He is very good. Farooq nodded silently, and we walked a little. My senses felt very gently attuned and alert. The hot air of the day had lost its edge. As the twilight drew on, perhaps we could smell the flower I love above all others, Raat Ki Rani, the queen of the night. I have since then witnessed Dr. Triguna many times and traveled with him to America. I have introduced him in various surroundings, the boardrooms of New York corporations, offices of politicians in Washington, and hospitals in Boston and California. Within a few minutes of his arrival, each room is the same. It has Dr. Triguna in it. He invariably fascinates everyone. Dr. Triguna places his 3 fingers on someone's pulse and starts his lion's mutter while I translate from Hindi into English. He shows right away that he knows these people. Very good, very healthy bodies in America, he will say, but very worried minds. People are living too fast. It will make them sick. He does not often feel happy thoughts in the pulse here. I believe he does not even see people as bodies. They are bundles of consciousness rising to meet him, something that is just them. A grain, like a seed of them, flows out from their hearts. It makes its way past the snags and eddies of their constitution. It meets with discords and blocks. Then it flows under Dr. Triguna's investigating fingers. Yes, this blood has gone by a bad valve or a bad thought. You like to think about anger. You should tell some jokes and watch the sunset once in a while. His few remarks are the ones you need to hear at the moment. Just you among all people, and at just this moment among all moments. His patients do not dread him because they feel understood, not simply diagnosed. What is most fascinating is that each disease is seen in its own right. No 2 diagnoses are ever the same. One man's skin cancer might be curable, another's resistant to treatment, and another's fatal. After spending considerable time with Dr. Triguna and exploring the methods of Ayurveda, I found it possible to explain much of it in our own language. I decided to take a few simple precepts and began to explicate them. I mean the most basic ideas, such as nature is composed of one intelligence. Humans are part of nature. Therefore our intelligence connects us to the universe. Dr. Brihaspati Dev Triguna stands out in my life as the master physician. He is also a master at his art, for what he does not do is what he does. He does not interfere with the patient's life. His fingers merely touch the pace of that life. They sense its rhythms. They extract the knowledge of disharmony, broken vibrations that might cause ill health. It is enough. There is only one healthy pace to Dr. Triguna, the pace of the cosmos. The essence of health is to attend to the cosmic pacemaker. Once that is done, disease is done. While I was browsing through a second-hand bookstore in Boston in 1980, I ran across a book on meditation. The book was on the dollar shelf. It looked interesting, and I took it home with me. What I knew about systems of meditation was practically nothing, but I had assumptions about them. It is impossible to come from India and not have a set of strong impressions about meditation. To me, meditation meant controlling the mind. The saying we all heard growing up was that the mind is like a drunken monkey, leaping this way and that in its maddened desires. Or it is like a flame that wavers in the wind and cannot be still. Or it is a wild elephant that can only be tamed by tying it to a post and waiting until exhaustion wore out the wildness. Meditation was the post. It was meant for hermits and the religiously inclined. It led to inner peace, but primarily for those who renounced the world. If you were advanced enough and willing enough to give up everything else in life, then meditation held out a precious reward. It broke the bonds of ignorance. My main reason for picking up the book was that I sensed its novelty. Nothing quite like it was taught at home. Knowledge is like water. To be pure, it must keep running. The stream of wisdom that flows through India is very broad and very long, but no one would say that it is fresh. If a wandering monk decides to sit down in the middle of the street to go into meditation, then the cars will simply have to drive around him. The cows stepped around him 3,000 years ago. Why should anything change? Modern people in India may regret, and regret very deeply, that the tradition of enlightenment no longer appeals to us. But we also sense that the knowledge is stagnant and therefore not pure. We Indians still believe that our ancient texts contain a legacy for all people. The promise of Ayurveda, for instance, is that it is medicine for humankind. Yet every phrase in the Rig Veda or Bhagavad Gita seems to have given rise to a different sect, and each one wants to compete for the truth. This book managed to finesse my prejudices, at least the worst ones, by not confronting the old ways at all. The language actually seemed to apply equally to everyone. Instead of ignorance and bondage, it talked of stress accumulating in the body. In place of liberation, it talked of getting to the point where the stress has been dissolved. Drunken monkeys or chained elephants were not referred to because mind control or concentration was not allowed. The whole business of working strenuously for enlightenment had been dropped. Correct meditation was an effortless process that led to deeper relaxation. It released stress. Spiritual attainment was still the great goal it had been for uncounted centuries, but it was meaningless to dwell on it as long as the body and mind were unprepared. I found this sensible enough. The process of stress release also sounded believable, and I could use it since I was not a stranger to stress. At that time, I was very proud of my beeper. Doctors wear beepers on their hips the way marshals used to wear 6 guns. When you have a beeper, you don't forget that you're a doctor. Anyone can call you, day or night. You don't have to miss any emergencies. You boost your nerves to a state of constant vigilance, monitoring all your cases all the time. My beeper was especially vigilant. It beeped for me in restaurants. It beeped in the car, at concerts, and in bed. When I got up to answer a call, people looked at me with a little irritation and a lot of respect. A doctor was going to save a patient's life. But my days were blurring into nights. I was drinking black coffee by the hour and smoking at least a pack of cigarettes a day. I had acquired a taste for whiskey in the evening. My schedule kept my stomach mildly churning all the time, and I never stopped carrying the burning taste of gastric juice in my mouth. The idea of stress management was in the air, and there was abundant proof to show that meditation relieved stress. So why not? I found that meditation was easy. It also made very little claim upon my time, since the sittings for meditation were only 15 to 20 minutes long twice a day, nothing at all compared to what is required of a devotee in India. Nor did you have to possess a devotee's strong beliefs. The ideal attitude is to meditate for 20 minutes, get up from the chair, and forget that the meditation has ever taken place. I am going into a few of these particulars because the meditation did work beautifully. Within a week I stopped drinking. 2 weeks later I quit smoking. This had been a more serious problem, yet one morning on rounds I noticed that 3 days had gone by without a cigarette. It came to me like that, as an afterthought. I told myself that I must have lost the taste, as in fact I had, but the actual change happened in my mind. I didn't need the taste. After a few slips backward, the need never returned. These few improvements in my life made a dramatic difference out of proportion to the way they sound as I say them. I began once again to feel extraordinarily well. My spirits rose noticeably day after day until I was feeling too buoyant to talk to anyone about it without embarrassing myself. The only person I told was my friend Vinod, who practiced a form of meditation taught to him by his guru. I left my paperback about meditation on Vinod's doorstep one evening. I felt foolish in the morning, but within 3 hours he called me and asked me when he could start. Now there were 2 of us following the practice. We were calling it real meditation because we felt that an undeniable breakthrough had been made in a tradition that cashes in more on legends than on results. My first experience with meditation was remarkable. It was quiet and serene and without strain. You didn't seem to be doing anything, but something more personal was occurring, like a curtain being drawn aside at midnight. Suddenly you see what needs to be seen. One of the sacred writings in the Upanishads says, when the mind is overcome by its own radiance, then dreams are no longer seen. Joy and peace come to the body. I was waking up to that, lightly and peacefully. But the new life was so new that for the first month I hardly dared to look into it. Vinod and I grew shy about putting our experience with meditation into words, even though we had talked about it before. Something very desirable, yet unbelievable, was happening. I remember being so taken with bewildered happiness that I said to him, "It's true, just that." Vinod understood. The inner genius had to move slowly for fear that its joy would be too much. The heart had to be protected for so long while it was small. We did not fool ourselves. Perfection had not seized us all at once. We couldn't even have said very coherently what perfection meant. It was early. Our noses had just got the smell of sea breezes, but we knew we would reach the sea. In India, it is said that the teacher or acharya embodies the truth he talks about. If he can effectively teach it, his disciple becomes the next embodiment, and in that way, generation after generation, the living links are forged. However different one teacher may be from another, they are still alike, and they are all linked together. Through them, wisdom renews itself in every generation. In a real sense, silence is the wisest value a rishi possesses, because it needs no arguments to persuade. In the presence of a rishi, the listener becomes like a rishi himself. Everyone possesses rishi value. This is the soul itself. This is the capacity for wisdom. This is the highest level of our own consciousness. If silence is cultivated, as in meditation, using no effort or struggle, then its power will increase until ignorance and disease disappear, for one has discovered the soul of life itself. Human life becomes much simpler once we find the silence that is nature's heart. In 1985, I helped to set up the first major Ayurvedic health center in America. Many people have come to that center and to the current one in San Diego to receive the simple yet profound medicine that Ayurveda offers. Almost all the people who come for Ayurvedic treatment are meditators or learn meditation when they get there. They undertook Ayurveda as part of a seasonal routine for maintaining health and also to promote the best possible inner experiences. Ayurveda can actually provide awareness because it makes no firm distinction between the body and the psyche. Balancing the physical system affects both. Another proportion of our patients came to us with developed diseases. Sometimes they had been diagnosed as fatal, otherwise they had advanced degenerative disorders that conventional medicine did not relieve. In this second group was Mr. Diaz, 70 years old and a senior member of a powerful Latin American family, which means that he was wealthy enough to fly to the United States for care. When I first saw him, the day he arrived in this country, it was obvious that he was a very sick man. He was carrying 170 pounds on a 5 foot 4 inch frame that should have carried closer to 135 pounds. Because of extremely high blood pressure, his heart was beginning to back up fluid into his lungs, which is a condition called congestive heart failure. Even sitting up caused him to wheeze. Because his heart condition was serious, Mr. Diaz had been put on maximum medication to bring down his blood pressure, but it was not helping. I could see that he might have heart failure soon. It was not surprising to find that quite a few other things had gone wrong in his body. His digestion was bad because of ballooning pockets in his colon or diverticulosis. These pockets collected toxins from his digestive tract as food passed through and became painfully inflamed. His prostate was also swollen, making it painful for him to pass urine. Mr. Diaz was sent to our clinic for this variety of disorders that he could not cope with, but there was really only one thing that could help him, his body's inner intelligence. Ayurveda defines this as the organizing power that flows from its deep source in the self and coordinates every aspect of the physical system. Although he was very sick, Mr. Diaz had not lost this intelligence. He had certainly not been in touch with it for a long time, or he would not have been in the shape that he was in. I put him immediately on the most intensive Ayurvedic plan, including learning to meditate. Mr. Diaz spoke English well enough so that I could give him a pep talk. It came straight from Ayurveda, but with no special jargon. I said, while you're here, our goal should not be to fight disease, but to restore you to happiness. You are not happy now because you have lost self-control. Your body is your choice. You have created this diseased body that you have. You can create a healthy body using the same ability. Given the right guidance, your body can reset itself, even if it has almost gone over the brink already. It's finally up to you. No one else can create a new body for you but yourself. This approach began to pay off in a remarkably short time. His body's inner intelligence just had not had the chance to help him. He had been too busy creating so many problems for himself. We didn't even have to do all that much. The philosophy of Ayurveda is to do the minimum. Simply remove the inner obstacles and let nature do the rest. By putting him on the correct Ayurvedic diet, reducing his salt and fat intake to a bare minimum, and getting him to meditate, we made Mr. Diaz feel much better right away. All sorts of things began to happen for him. He lost 10 pounds. His congestive heart failure was dramatically alleviated. His blood pressure dropped to 110/70. That was lower than any reading he had ever seen since he was an adolescent. Instead of wheezing when he sat up, he began to enjoy a brisk half-hour walk in the morning. Because he felt energetic and much more alive, he began to lengthen his walks to an hour. The exercise and fresh air brought a glow to his skin, and for the first time his body looked vital. Clinically, we found it possible to taper off the medications for the high blood pressure. By the end of his 2-week stay, they were far below maximum levels, and we hoped that soon he would be off all of them. His digestion had normalized so that the diverticulosis was no longer such a problem. His prostate improved by at least 50%, down from 30% obstruction to 15%. This came as an enormous relief to Mr. Diaz, since his doctors at home had told him that he must have immediate prostate surgery. After his stay, Mr. Diaz was tremendously enthusiastic. He had arrived knowing nothing about Ayurveda or the principles behind it, but some simple interventions directed to diet and daily routine turned his health around. If he continued on his program, there was every chance that he would improve even more. His body was once again the result of his own choice. Because the scene shifts every second of every day, life does stand on sand. But we have the choice to plant our feet in the universe. That is Ayurveda's revelation. Consciousness is primary to our existence, and in meditation one discovers it to be the one unchanging part of life. It turned into the first impulse of intelligence contained in the first cell that became you and me, no more than a flicker of life at the moment of conception, and yet containing the total information of the universe. Ayurveda says this: pay attention to that unchanging part of yourself. It is perfect, at the source of life, and only there one finds peace, harmony, and the undisturbed contentment of bliss. This message has thrilled all who have heard it in the past, and it will continue to thrill men and women as long as the Ayurvedic knowledge endures. Beneath the diversity evident to our senses lies one wholeness. We cannot comprehend this deeper reality with bits of our perception. It can only be touched through the mechanism of transcendence. Separation, fear, insecurity, hostility, they all result because we have lost touch with this continuum of life that is the source of all creation. When we are there, we realize that the self, that the Rishi, that the soul is no other than this unity, and this unity is no other than the self, the soul. With this realization comes compassion. With compassion comes love, and with love comes peace. With the proper guidance, anyone can be set on the path to perfection simply by knowing the self, simply by knowing the soul. When the eternal knower, the Rishi, wakes up in anyone, it proclaims, I must survive, I must create, I must be. That marks the moment when human life truly begins. That is the challenge I hand to you.